Okay, I am back for more carving. I took a break and had this again stored in my plastic until I was able to come back to it. It's actually just the next day, so not too much probably has changed in this, but just as a reminder, it had been stored in a plastic bag. So I left off at a point that I would maybe consider to be like 65% done. Remember, there's still a lot of great shape that or detail that I've started adding to this piece. But you know, I have a nice taper. I'm starting to work with this. I've got that layer added, and but it still has some extra nuance to carve into it. Maybe 70% at this point. So I'm just going to continue to plug away and maybe kind of play with a few different tools as I'm working, and just to kind of continue to remind myself where I am. It's also not a bad idea if it's been a day or two to take a scrap piece of your plaster and just kind of practice working with your tools or getting certain effects just as a little bit of a warm up. So instead of just diving right in, especially if you're at the part where you're getting closer to the detail, it might be good to kind of ease into it by practicing a little bit. I have a feeling some of you are going to try to use an X-Acto knife or maybe even a utility knife. And so I just want to make sure that if you do decide to use one of these, that you're sort of very careful and cautious. And so I'll just give you a few little pointers. If you are using an X-Acto knife, usually when we're cutting a sharp blade, when we're cutting paper, a sharp blade is safer and better, or cardboard or whatever. But if you are carving into plaster, it actually would probably be better to use a dull one of your blades. So if you have a container of your dull blades, that would probably be best to grab from. I usually put like X's on them or Sharpie marks so that I know which are my sharp and which are my dull. And then if you do decide to use like a utility knife, I just have this little cheap one here. A couple things to keep in mind is that you don't want the full blade extended to work with, because the more blade that is out, the more potential that you have to cut yourself. So you want to only have out as much as you think you might need in order to carve. And then the other thing just to know about is most of these blades have some kind of a lock. So this mechanism that allows it to go up and down also will have something that locks it into place so that it can't go up or down, which will help you as well, so that as you're carving, more doesn't come out or it doesn't sink in. So always pay attention that it's locked in place. And when you're not using it, retract the blade as well. So, and then if you are carving, think about where the rest of your body is in relation to what it is that you are carving. So I wouldn't just want to have this here and then just start carving without some kind of a control. So it might seem a little counterintuitive, but I actually usually have my thumb kind of at the back side of the blade, and I'm not being super aggressive with this. The idea is just to take off little bits at a time and not larger sections. And I think that this is going to be useful, like for example, to get along this cap and to make a nice sharp distinction between those two planes. Maybe for this angle here. And again, it's just like slow little bits. You're never trying to take off big chunks. So I do use these, but it's always with great awareness of, um, how much potential they have to cut. So if I'm super tired, this is not a tool that I will utilize. And if you can use it going away from you, if your form will allow for that, that's also good. It's a little safer. So I've been working on trying to round this and match it to that sort of shape, the top shape. And, you'll notice that this is a little bit blocky and kind of sharp. It's not round and smooth. That's okay. Try not to get obsessed with smoothing everything out as you go, because you have to modify and shape and adjust. That smoothing out is like the last step that you do. It's always really tempting, even for me, to just like focus in on an area and kind of get really obsessed about it. But again, try not to let yourself do that, because if you get to a point where you realize something is wrong or it needs to be fixed, and you spent an hour or two smoothing and polishing it out, you're going to be less likely to give yourself permission to undo or kind of erase all that work. So try to avoid that. And again, as this is getting a little thinner, I'm being a little bit more careful. I'm also aware that I'm putting pressure here, and I want to kind of think about that so that it doesn't snap. So my other hand is kind of cradling it and acting like a cushion. You could, if you had sort of more sponges or different things like that, also have it like on a little pillow for carving as well. But since it's so small, I just like it in my hand. So a couple things. Don't forget posture check-in. So I'm standing, and this table is at a height that's great for sort of working on medium-sized things, but not super small. So, I could possibly do a little bit of leaning to kind of have a little balance and support. I could get a chair so that I'm slightly lower to the piece, so that it's kind of a little closer to eye level. Again, I'm trying to avoid something where my head is looking down for extended periods of time. And so for me, I'm okay if I, again, lock in my elbows and just kind of hold it at about this level here. So always think about your body ergonomics, and then just kind of continue to pay attention to your form as you're going. I'm getting close to doing this little section here, which is quite thin and it's got some tiny little sections. So I want to be careful that I kind of slow down there a little bit. But also, if you have something that's really thin and really delicate, the plaster is not going to be able to handle that like a paper thin. But you could sort of fake it by tapering your form from something wider to something smaller, so that the end isn't like razor sharp, but just a little thinner. And that thinner edge will give the illusion that everything sort of further back also has that same kind of mass to it, or airiness, I should say. So those are ways that you can kind of get away with tricking the viewer into thinking things are more delicate or precious than they are. So one of the things that I just noticed that's kind of cool to give a little detail is that this edge here is kind of sticking out a little further. And so, where is it? I've been kind of trying to work to replicate that here by giving the illusion that this is narrower, and then that what is wrapping around, you can see it from coming from the front to the back and then back around to the front. Again, it's those little details that are really going to take a lot of time and effort to pay attention to. Those are the things that kind of help trick the viewer and sort of fool the eye, and also really kind of capture the attention of your viewer. And details like this, again, really require observation, not just guessing. So I've propped my object up so that I have a better view of it. So it's been 24 minutes since I've been carving. That feels, I kind of feel like I've only been here for 10 minutes. So I'm surprised that that much time has passed. The first part of this video seemed to like really go fast, right? So you block down your form, and then this is where you spend the time bringing it to life. So before I get too obsessed with this side, I'm going to turn it over, start working on the other, make sure that I'm not removing too much material or not enough material. I'm starting to kind of undercut now where that toothpaste is. You can see I'm getting a little more of a shadow there. I'm probably not going to go quite as deep as is actually there, but I definitely want to give that illusion of the fold. And I'm definitely getting thinner, so I want to keep paying attention to that. It can be useful as your plaster starts to get a little more dry, and as you start kind of getting finer detail work, to maybe have some kind of a little stiff bristled brush that you can use to kind of help get some of those little things off as you're working. Okay, so this is fairly subtle, but I'm working to offset this whole top. So remember earlier I had said that I saw this edge came out to the side a little bit, which also meant that the opposite side kind of started shifting, I guess, that way. And so I have a little excess here, which means that I have to kind of take that much away over here. So just been slowly whittling away at that. It might not be a bad idea for me to start moving on to another section before I go quite too far here. So I think that this edge needs to be considered a little bit more. I feel like it needs just a little bit more of a taper to it. But I don't want to remove too much material, so I'm going to be kind of really careful as I go here. Will this work? Prop this up. So again, you can maybe see this is why this is one of my favorite tools, is it can just get into that little edge there and kind of pick out that detail. But if all you have is a needle tool, that also can work. Sometimes it's not just like drawing the line, but it's pressing the tool down to kind of carve or lifting it up to carve, as opposed to just thinking you're making a line. You can get a little bit more out of the needle tool in that case. And I can even sort of like lay it at an angle and drag this along that edge there to kind of help make that plane. More level. I found a nice little kink in the tube. I don't know if you can see that, but I want to try to catch that shadow by kind of breaking those planes up. Okay, so there are still lots of subtle nuances on this tube that I could carve into this form. And I am going to add a few as I go, but also just for the sake of time for this video, I'm going to kind of speed a few of the steps along. And so I'm going to work on cleaning up this cap. I'm going to work on defining these edges a little bit. I'm going to use the green scrubby to kind of smooth things out, and then maybe go in and add a few of those extra defined planes. I say I'm going to do it quickly, but we'll see how long that actually. This is also maybe where a few of these smaller tools will come into play. I kind of forgot about them hanging out over there. I'm trying to carve this like delicate little fold in here. If you've never done something like this before, again, this is where taking a scrap piece of soap, practicing with different tools, and trying to recreate that shape can be really useful and really helpful. I sort of know that like sticking my tool and kind of picking it in or poking it into the plaster at this stage where I'm so fine and detailed is better than me trying to draw the line. I end up usually messing it up a little more. But again, that's each of you sort of finding what works best for you. So I'm starting to get a little of that detail better. Might switch to the other side just to kind of give that other side a little chance to rest. And also for me not to push it too far. Really slow and steady, trying not to chip and carve away parts that I don't want to fall or break. And even though this line is sort of curling and wrapping around, I'm just carving little areas. Don't forget to turn your piece. If something isn't doing what you want it to do with your tool, it might just be that you need to turn your piece. Another thing to think about is bracing your hands if you're doing fine detail work, figuring out how the two hands can work together to kind of control the movements. So this little twist here is probably pretty close to what I'll be going for. There are some darker shadows in here, and I just don't really have the material to pick away at that. Instead, I focused on sort of shifting really subtly some of these planes so that like this inside piece is going to be sticking out just a little further than the back piece. I will reverse course and just sort of double check on the other side. I feel like I did this side much better because I had a little practice here. So again, that's where testing out on your other scraps could be useful. I'm looking at my quick. It's been now an hour and 12 minutes since I started the second half of the video, so I'm having fun with the detail, even though I said I was going to be quick. So that's looking better. What I'm going to do next is just kind of round those edges so they don't feel quite as flat, and that will help do that effect I was talking about where it can kind of seem a little bit thinner than it actually is. I don't want to make it razor thin like a, piece of paper, but if I'm slow and careful, I can get it just visually a little thinner. My hands are starting to get crampy, so probably because I've been carving for an hour and 15 minutes straight. It's not a bad idea to take a break, stretch your hands a little bit, look further off into the distance. Okay, so this is one of my favorite tricks or tools, which is the green scrubby. If you can kind of see how there are tool marks that are visible in here, and my goal is to hide these tool marks. I don't want to give away that this was carved. That's my aesthetic choice, to kind of disguise those tool marks. There might be a reason why it would be really interesting to show the marks or the making of, but oftentimes they get left just because you don't know how to remove them or make them sort of feel more intentional. But I have this green Scotch-Brite Scrubby, and I don't like the generic brand. I get the Scotch-Brite brand. Dip it in just a little bit of water, and it polishes up the surface. It's really quite satisfying how much it can start removing those tool marks. Now, because this plaster piece has been stored in a bag and it's still got moisture in it, I'm kind of getting a little bit of a slimy surface. So probably wouldn't be a terrible idea to leave this out of the bag overnight and then come back tomorrow to really kind of clean it up. Or I'm just going to add less water to this so that I'm kind of using the moisture in the plaster. And if this starts to get dirty, you can just re-rinse it in your water. And sometimes I'll use this and then I'll go back in with one of my tools to sort of make more of a sharp, distinct edge. It really depends on the form that you're making and what is required of it, but this can be useful for getting rid of some of those major tool marks. And it can sand off quite a bit, so I'm being gentle and kind of observant as I'm going, so I don't unintentionally take off more than I wanted. So that got that really smooth. And now I want to add just a few more breaks in the planes. I'm being really careful down here because I'm focusing so heavily on this spot. It can be easy to just zone out and snap. So remind yourself. I think I've also mentioned this before, that sometimes in order to really get the full effect of something, you might need to exaggerate it a little further, or sort of push it, or create more of a sharp edge just to bend the light. So there's a couple of those little folds and kinks and bends that I kind of worked on. And again, I think that this plaster is still just a little wet to really get all of the details that I want. Oh, and look what I totally forgot. This inside here has this nice hollow edge. Am I gonna try it? What should I do? What's my strategy? So I think the first thing to do would actually be to decide what I'm going to do about these lines, the tooth marks. I think at one point I had mentioned, oh, maybe this would work okay. This is my serrated edge rib. In some ways it's nice because it gives me uniform lines. They're not very deep though. So could I make them deeper? And like, how close should they be together? Sometimes if they're too close, then that middle edge, the space between them chips. I think I'm gonna use this. So first I want to cut in here a little deeper. You know, I suppose I could try to give myself a straight edge. Something that I laid against here to kind of trace against. I don't really know if I have. This works okay. Sometimes if you're trying to draw a straight line into your plaster, it just sort of goes all over the place, and so it's not a bad idea to have something to line up. And this is actually working pretty good. It's round, but as long as I pay attention to the angle of my needle tool, it works out pretty good. And I'm just eyeballing it, as you can tell. But if you need more precision, you can measure. So that's what those gave me. I don't know if you can see them quite yet because even I don't feel like they're quite deep enough. So this hook tool I think is going to work good. I get to just decide if I'm going to pull it towards me or pull it away. It's often the start and the stop where things can go wrong with this fine little detail or carving lines or edges. So really pay attention to your pressure. So that's a little better. I don't know if you can see. And then again, I think a little more detail would be slightly better if this were just a little drier, but I'm gonna do one last little detail, famous last words, and try to see if I can sink this in just a little bit. So I'm trying to kind of draw the circle shape on the top. If you noticed, I didn't just draw it, I kind of sketched it. And it looks kind of rough, but I just want to give myself an idea of what I'm going to hollow out. And on this cap, this is really thin, but there's no way that I'm going to get it that thin. So I'm going to just sort of create that little indent, but not too far. So I'm getting there. You can already see how shadow is catching. Maybe just a few more little rounds here, and then I'm gonna call it good. It's been an hour and 40 minutes. That's too much carving in a row. Okay, so I might off camera still do a little bit of playing with this, but I think that this could certainly be considered complete. And the other thing that I would want to decide is if I wanted to do any kind of information about this logo, it might have been useful had I saved a little more material here so I could have carved it just a little higher. It's always really strange if you just sort of write or scratch in the letters. So I would avoid that. You know, maybe it's something that I practice with some soap before I decide if that's necessary or not. Okay, well, hopefully this has given you some insight into the amount of time and the sort of patience that you need to have when you go from the large form to something a little bit more focused. And I went kind of fast, and then all of a sudden it's like that last part just slow. So have fun and good luck.